The wheels will one day be back on the rails, for this is no railway scrapyard. It's the largest operating railway museum in Australia, the New South Wales Rail Transport Museum at Thirlmere, just south of Sydney. Loco 2029 was built in 1911. 33 of the 264 Bayer Peacock side tankers were built, and this one is preserved at Thirlmere along with about 50 other locomotives. Their survival is due to the dedication and enthusiasm of hundreds of men and women who at the end of the steam era decided not to let all their railway history go to the scrapyard. They formed a preservation society in 1962 and 10 years later opened a museum at Enfield in Sydney. The museum moved to Thirlmere in 1975. Diesel 7921 was one of 4 imported from the United States by the Department of Munitions during World War II. The 12-acre site at Thirlmere is leased from the State Rail Authority. Museum members have constructed impressive facilities for restoration work, storage and display. On this day, some 15,000 people came to Thirlmere because the museum was having a special guest, the Flying Scotsman. Although the Scot was the star of the day, the other engines got their share of attention, including this 1912 survivor of Sydney's gravel pits. The confrontation between steam and diesel is now history. 4201 was among the early diesels that pushed steam onto the scrapyard loop. It was designed by General Motors and built at Clyde Engineering in Sydney in 1955. In the little league of steam engines is this Krauss side tank loco built in 1907. In the big league is 3642, one of the famed 36 class express engines known as pigs because of a grunting sound they made under heavy steaming stress. The first was built at Everleigh in Sydney in 1925. One recorded an impressive 73 miles an hour on an express run between Sydney and Newcastle. The gigantic Garrett had the highest pulling power of any steam loco in Australia and is one of the largest of its kind in the world. It weighs 263 tonnes. The Bayer Peacock engine has 4 cylinders fed by a central boiler. They were imported from Britain in the 1950s, and this one was the last steam train to come into service in New South Wales. They could haul huge loads of wheat and minerals, but they had a short life. The end of the steam age was in sight. The Festival of Steam to welcome the Flying Scotsman to Thirlmere included several traction engines. When steam was king, it ruled farm and industry as well as the railways. The crowd to welcome the Flying Scotsman brought the train to a halt outside Thirlmere. It had travelled from Sydney with New South Wales loco 5910 and been joined at nearby Picton by the museum's 3001. As happened everywhere the visiting British loco went, people of all ages flocked to see it. For steam fans, the sight of the Scot working with some of their local engines was an event not to be missed. The Flying Scot had to be turned around for the return trip later in the day, another attraction for those who enjoy every detail of railway operations. It was unlikely that many of them would ever again see the Flying Scot on a turntable. It was a slow business which had its own appeal for steam fans. Certainly something different from the usual fleeting trackside view of the loco roaring past. An electric motor was to push the Scot around 180 degrees, but to everyone's amazement, the turntable stuck fast. Volunteers jumped down to give a hand, but to no avail. After minutes of frustration, a tractor was called in, and at last the turntable began to roll smoothly. 4472 was built in 1923 at Doncaster for the London and North East Railway. It steamed more than 2 million miles before going into an active retirement in 1963. The design and workmanship in 4472 led to the loco being displayed at the British Empire exhibition in 1924-25. The day at Thirlmere was but one of many highlights during the year-long visit to Australia. An extraordinary steam train adventure that began in September 1988 in London. Port authorities on the River Thames had to make special arrangements for handling 4472 because it's an unusually heavy and bulky piece of cargo. A big floating crane was used to get the loco from Dockside Railway to the P&O container ship. Initiative for the trip came from organisers of Steam 88, a Melbourne-based group of steam enthusiasts who wanted the Flying Scotsman for their bicentennial steam festival, part of Australia's celebrations marking the 200th anniversary of white settlement. In Sydney, the loco was unloaded from the NZ Pacific at White Bay. Sydney was the only port in Australia with a crane big enough for the job. The floating crane lifted the engine easily and carried it across the harbour to a track at Pyrmont. The engine was fitted out at State Rail workshops and was soon on its way to Victoria and its hosts in Melbourne. In Melbourne, the Steam Festival Open Day attracted tens of thousands of people. Steam engines representing a century of steam history in Australia were on display. It was the biggest steam event ever organised in Australia, and the star attraction, of course, was the Flying Scotsman. There was also a big demand for seats on board excursions hauled by 4472. Demand was such that many extra trips had to be scheduled. Among the memorable trips made by 4472 in Victoria was a parallel run with the pride of Victoria's restored steam engines, locomotive R761. The Flying Scotsman spent 2 months in Victoria and in December crossed the border into New South Wales for the next stage of its Australian adventure. A huge crowd turned out at Moss Vale in the Southern Highlands for the state's official welcoming ceremony. The crews were by now quite accustomed to coping with the endless line of people who wanted to get inside the cab. However, the British caretaker crew still had 10 months to go and countless questions to answer over and over again. Australian railwaymen drove the engine on all runs, but the British crew acted as advisors and ensured that the engine was kept in first-class running order. The Flying Scotsman had an escort of 2 Australian engines for the run into Sydney Terminal. The American Baldwin-built 5910 was the first to steam out of Moss Vale. The Australian designed and built Pacific Class 3801 was the second escort. The Flying Scotsman followed and made a brave sight as it rolled through the beautiful Highland countryside. The name Flying Scotsman was bestowed on trains running between London and Edinburgh in Scotland way back in 1862. However, it's Loco 4472 that has become known as the steaming symbol of the old express service. The run was at a modest turn of speed, but it was easy to imagine the Loco in its historic role, hauling express trains non-stop between King's Cross in London and Edinburgh. It inaugurated the non-stop service in 1928, 60 years before its trip to Australia. This was not the Scots' first trip abroad. In the 1970s, it went to the United States, a trip that ended in financial disaster and almost led to the Scot being stranded in America. However, the story of its Australian visit was already a success story, and there was no chance of it being stranded here. The return trip was guaranteed. But before it left, the Scot would write itself into the record books. Another tunnel, but this time something different. The Flying Scotsman and 3801 double heading on their way from Sydney to Brisbane, Easter 1989. The normally pleasant water views along the Hawkesbury River system were marred because of the weather, and this was to be the pattern for almost the entire trip to the Queensland capital. It was the middle of the wettest period since records have been kept in New South Wales. That might have dampened the atmosphere, but not the spirits of the enthusiasts on this memorable 1,200-mile journey. Everywhere, the crowds turned out, despite the rain. At Wingham on the mid-north coast, one of the spectators was Ron Hearn.
When I was 6 years of age, in Wembley, in England, my father took me to the British Empire exhibition, where he took me onto the footplate of the Flying Scotsman engine, or 4472, which was then on display for the first time publicly. The engine was built in 1923, but this was the first time it had been on public display. And I remember him taking me to that engine and showing me, remarking on the size of it and the size particularly of the driving wheels. He was only 5'5", and the driving wheels towered above his head.
The weather improved marginally when the Scot crossed into Queensland. After all, Queensland bills itself as the sunshine state. At least the weather was warmer, and Queenslanders turned out at every siding for a look at the two big steam engines. At some stations there was a picnic atmosphere as families waited for the train to arrive. For these bushfolk, a rich moment indeed. All the sights and sounds and smell of the steam age. And, as a bonus, one of the most famous steam engines in the world from the other side of the world. At Roma Street Station in Brisbane, the interstate terminal, a massive crowd lined up to welcome the Scot. British crewman engineer Roland Kennington described it in one word: unbelievable. It was a sunset arrival, and the first time since leaving Sydney that the train and passengers had a dry run into a major station. It seemed that everyone on the platform and surrounding vantage points had a camera. Indeed, the Flying Scotsman must be the most photographed engine in the world. After the visit to Queensland, the Flying Scotsman made several trips double-heading with 3801 to various parts of New South Wales. On this occasion, it was a heavy haul over the Blue Mountains to the mining and railway town of Lithgow. The Scot wasn't designed for mountain climbing, and some sceptics predicted it wouldn't perform well on the steep grades in New South Wales. But they were wrong. The Scot crossed the mountains 7 times and handled the steepest grades with amazing efficiency for an engine some 66 years old. But there were bigger challenges ahead, including a trip of 4,000 miles from Melbourne to the very centre of Australia and back to Sydney. Spencer Street Station in Melbourne, and 4472 stands ready to begin its epic journey to Alice Springs in Central Australia. Thousands came to say goodbye and to enjoy the steam spectacle organised to mark the occasion. It was a farewell in really grand style. R707, owned by Victorian Railways and restored by volunteer railwaymen, would run alongside Steam Rail 761 to provide an escort for the Scot on the first stage of the great journey inland.
Just for Alice Springs and intermediate points, may board the train now.
The 3 magnificent locos moved out of Spencer Street together, but all eyes were on the Flying Scotsman. It exhausted a great cloud of steam that gave the platform the atmosphere of a misty Scottish morning. Nowhere else in Australia is there a combination of gauges and multiple tracks running so close together for so far. The different gauges are an accident of history, the result of state rivalries last century. The standard gauge used by 4472 was put down in the 1960s as part of a new national line all over the country. The legend of the Flying Scotsman has inspired artists and poets, including a Scottish-born poet, Will Ogilvie. Ogilvie became a poet while wandering the Australian bush as a horse tamer and drover at the turn of the century. When he returned to Britain, he was inspired by a trip on the Flying Scotsman and wrote a poem in celebration of its journey, swift on wheels of thunder from the Thames to the Tweed. 4472 was the first steam locomotive to officially record a speed of 100 miles an hour. That was in 1934 on a journey between Leeds and London. The special run was organised as an answer to the challenge of a German diesel electric known as the Flying Hamburger, which ran between Berlin and Hamburg at record speeds. The Flying Scotsman made mincemeat of the Flying Hamburger, beating all its speed records. It not only clocked up 100 miles an hour, that's 160 kilometres an hour, but also sustained average speeds of 98 miles an hour for long distances. The R-class locomotives were designed by the Victorian Railways for post-war passenger express trains. 70 of the class were built in Glasgow by the North British Locomotive Company, and the first was delivered in 1951. With power outputs in excess of 2,000 horsepower, the Rs showed spirited style on the right tracks, easily clocking speeds of 70 miles an hour. However, these excellent locos were too late. The diesels were already taking over.
They go on either side of the three tracks and off the ballast. If you're standing on the edge of the ballast, the train will stop, and that will ruin the photo for 1,000 people. So would you please move off, right off the ballast.
It was unlikely that an event such as this would ever be seen again, so organisers planned for the photo run to be repeated. The first run would be with the locos slightly staggered. The second time, they'd be running line abreast. To the delight of steam enthusiasts, and particularly the photographers, the great blue-black storm clouds provided a fabulous backdrop to the event, and the sun struggled through to highlight the foreground. In Seymour, there was yet another steam spectacular, a line-up in the marshalling yards of 4 working steam locomotives, 2R class, 4472 and J515. J515 is owned by the Victorian Railways, but allocated to the Seymour Loco Steam Preservation Group for operating. After 4 years of restoration work, J515 began steaming again in 1988. And while all this was happening in Victoria, out back at Alice Springs in the Centralian Desert, another steam event was taking place. Alice Springs is just a big country town, but to most Australians, the Alice is symbolic of the heart of the outback, the Red Heart. You travel across 1,000 miles of emptiness to get there and find, yes, a steam train trundling across the desert. It's called the Ghan, after the Afghan camel drivers who served the outback before the railway arrived. This loco from the Ghan Preservation Society was taking part in the annual King of the Desert race, a 25-kilometre fun run in which the runners also compete against the train. It's a fair race because the old narrow gauge railway line won't allow the Ghan to go very fast. Indeed, in the old days, no one ever asked if the Ghan was on time. Simply to arrive on the right day was considered good enough. So while the Flying Scotsman was parallel running in Victoria, the Ghan was warming up with this desert trip in preparation for its welcome to the International Star. The unexpected highlight of the day was typically Centralian. Our cameraman fell off the engine. The Flying Scotsman, running on the relatively new standard gauge line, aroused great curiosity at the Alice. It was the first steam train on the new line, but what impressed the Centralians was its touch of class. The old Ghan locos had character, but certainly not class. Brought together just outside Alice Springs for a short parallel run and photo stop, the two engines were an odd couple. As a steam buff put it, the famous and the infamous. It was certainly an historic occasion, and for the train crews, one that would be a treasured memory. This quaint steam event in the outback came only a few days after the Scots set a world record for a steam engine. It travelled 428 miles, 684 kilometres, non-stop between Parkes and Broken Hill in New South Wales. The run took just over 9 hours. After this, there was to be another run right across the continent from Sydney to Perth and back. Then the voyage home, making 4472 the first steam engine to circumnavigate the world. Truly a notable trailblazer that quite literally left a blazing trail at the Alice. The 1960s saw the end of practically all steam operations on the Tasmanian railway system. The 1980s saw it come back, not as part of the normal railway service, but as a tourist attraction. One of the most remarkable steam restoration projects in Tasmania was initiated by two men, Tony Cohen and Dr. David Fletcher, both from Hobart. In 1979, they acquired by public tender locomotive H2 from Australian National Railways. This film was taken 8 years later, after a massive restoration project. The occasion was a tourist run from Hobart up the picturesque Derwent River Valley to Mountfield National Park. The Tasmanian Locomotive Company was formed by Tony Cohen and David Fletcher and a handful of friends. Originally, they expected to do no more than simply save the loco from the scrapyard. As it turned out, they ended up with a mainline train. The loco is one of 8 H-class engines imported from the Vulcan Foundry in Lancashire in 1951. H2 has a 482 wheel configuration known as the mountain type. After 9 years of service, mainly in northern Tasmania, it was put into storage in 1960. 8 years later it was serviced, the last overhaul of a steam loco by Tasmanian Railways. It continued in service until 1975, when a serious crack in the inner firebox condemned the boiler. When private restoration began, H2 was kept in the Hobart Roundhouse. Demolition of the roundhouse forced H2 out of town, to the branch line at Cadbury's chocolate factory.
The last time you saw that we did it.
The first steaming of the loco took place on November 24, 1986, 10 years after the loco had been condemned. Repairs included replating of the inner firebox and refitting and cladding the refurbished boiler. With 3 carriages from the old Tasman Limited and 2 from the Emu Bay Railway, the loco can take up to 324 passengers on its trips. The purple colour scheme was adopted as a way of saying thanks to Cadbury's. Sponsorship was eventually taken over by Cascade Brewery, and the livery was changed to Brewery Blue. The red line on the tender is taken from the Tasmanian coat of arms. Because of the danger of bushfires, the loco is not allowed to run during the summer months. However, bad weather has never deterred the ardent steam fan, and young and old turned out for the trip up the valley, past the hop fields, oast houses and villages to Mountfield National Park. There's a stopover of 2 hours at the National Park. Time to take in the beauty of the cold climate rainforest and to enjoy a barbecue. The Tasmanian Locomotive Company keeps steaming because of the enthusiasm of its shareholders. They come from many walks of life: motor mechanic, boiler maker, publican, printer, engineer, spray painter, public servant, teacher, housewife, all share a love of steam. It's a special run because many regard it as one of the most beautiful sections of railway line in Australia. It doesn't have to be perfect weather for a perfect day. The Derwent Valley and the old loco combine to make it one of the great little train journeys Australia has to offer.